Hey guys, I will be making a video on the Great Flood. I know some of you think that this is just a nonsensical story connected to biblical fundamentalism, and why should you even believe this since it's been so thoroughly discredited? Well, to some sense you are correct. There certainly was not a global flood that occurred. I don't know what the theory was, whether it was 5 or 3,000 years ago. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that the flood myth is so prevalent, so widely dispersed, that it has to account or be explained by a common ancestor or a common origin, right? Because if we find the flood all over the world and it is in fact connected through transmission, then the only place that it can go back to would be before human beings left Africa, some 70,000 years ago or more. Now, this is the thesis of E.J. Michael Witzel's book, The Origins of the World's Mythologies, and he speaks of mythological systems in general, as well as particular myths. And his theory is that basically the world's mythologies all have a common ancestor. And he subdivides it into two groups. The oldest one, which is called Gondwanan. This is when human beings first left Africa, and we moved eastwards across the Middle East and Asia, all the way into Australia. And then later on, there was a development somewhere, he proposes, in the Middle East for what he calls Eurasian mythology, which developed some 40,000 years ago. All right, but not to complicate this too much, basically I'm just going to go over a couple flood myths to first demonstrate that this is very widespread and archaic. Now, we're all familiar with the story of Noah, that God called a man by the name of Noah to build an ark. He saved himself, his family, and two of each animal in preparation for the flood. This is correlated to, and most likely founded upon, at least in some degree, to the Mesopotamian myth of Gilgamesh. Okay? Most people are aware of that, and this is why most people discount the flood myth. But again, most people are also not aware that the same or similar myth is found in India. So in India, there's a myth of Manu, M-A-N-U, who is warned by a fish that a great flood will come and that he needs to build a boat to save himself and others. All right? So when you look at this area, right, we have India, over here we have Mesopotamia and Israel. So you can say that perhaps these three myths are all connected by diffusion. Right, relatively close to one another. It's possible that by transmission of word of mouth that this could have spread. All right, but what now if we find a flood myth in South America? Okay, specifically in Guatemala, where we have the Mayan population used to live. Right, well, to some degree the Mayan people still do exist, but the Mayan civilization, which existed around Guatemala, the Aztecs were also in Central America as well. They all have a flood myth. In fact, if we look at the Popol Vuh, which is basically the oral tradition of the Maya reduced to writing. This was by the order of the Spanish conquistadors, or at least the Spanish in general commanded them to do this, but this is largely regarded as an authentic work, something that reflects actual Mayan thought, religious beliefs, and mythology that is not influenced by Western thought. Okay, so this actually is an authentic reflection of what the Mayans believed. And this particular version can be found on Mesoweb, MESOWEB.com, and this was translated by Alan J. What's his name? Christensen. And I've highlighted this part here, which is where he actually, or where the mythology speaks of the destruction of one of the earlier forms of humanity. And this humanity was created out of wood. All right. They were first created by the gods and then destroyed by the gods because they failed to give the gods the honor, the remembrance, and the worship that the gods desired. So they were wiped out by a flood. Now, this is what Christensen notes, and he's a professor from the University of Brigham Young. And in his comment here, note 123, he says, quote, "The destruction of the earth by flood prior to our present age was a widespread tradition in Mesoamerica." And he quotes further, "There was among them information of the flood and of the end of the world, and they called it Butik, which is the word which means flood of many waters and means judgment. And so they believe that another Butik is about to come, which is another flood and judgment, not of water, but of fire, which they say would be the end of the world, in which all the creatures would reprove, especially those which serve man, like the stones on which they grind their corn and wheat, the pots, the vessels, etc." Okay, so basically what this is saying is that this myth, destruction by a flood, was very widespread, okay, in Central and South America. And this is just one example. You can find examples among the Aztecs. You can find an example among those of Terra del Fuego, which is this very isolated and remote region of South America. Okay, so this is clearly taught here. Now, if we propose that there is a common ancestor, a common origin, we have an interesting dilemma, right? Because humans crossed over from Siberia into North America by the Bering Land Bridge, which disappeared 11,000 years ago, which means that the flood myth has to be at least 11,000 years old. But because South America was populated as early as 20,000 years ago, then the flood myth must be even older. And we find it in even more remote areas of the world. So here, okay, between India and Southeast Asia, we have the Andaman Islands. And I've spoken of these islands before because they're a great source of authentic and original mythological sources. All right, this island has been one of the most isolated parts of the world. The people living here were basically, had no contact with the outside world until the British discovered them in the 19th century. All right. You may remember a few years ago where a missionary went to this island called North Sentinel and was killed by the people there that are still living, a very original lifestyle, right, in a hunter-gatherer form. So because of its isolation, these islands reflect very archaic beliefs. And among the people of the Andaman Islands, they believed in a global flood. So they also had remnants of an archaic monotheism, where their high god, Paluga, wiped out basically every human being because of a sin or a mistake that they made. The flood only left 4 humans, 2 men and 2 women, and from them the world was repopulated. And I'll actually read the myth that they circulated amongst themselves. Witzel notes this, and Now let me just go ahead and read the myth that was circulated among the Andaman Islands. So Witzel quotes this as, quote, "Sometime after their creation, men grew disobedient. In anger, Puluga, the creator, who is their high god and supreme god, sent a flood which covered the whole land except perhaps Saddle Peak, where Puluga himself resided. Of all creatures, the only survivors were 2 men and 2 women, who had the fortune to be in a canoe when the flood came. The waters sank and they landed, but they found themselves in a sad plight. Puluga recreated birds and animals for their use, but the world was still damp and without fire. After the people had warmed themselves and had leisure to reflect, they began to murmur against the Creator and even plotted to murder him. However, the Creator warned them away from such a rash action, explained that men had brought the flood on themselves by their disobedience, and that another such offense would likewise be met with punishment. That was the last time the Creator spoke with men face to face." So how interesting is that, right? I mean, you can see many parallels there. They actually include that they were saved by a boat, right? They actually survived by boat. And Mircea Eliade in his book notes that prior to withdrawing, Pelaga teaches human beings his law one more time. So there is a covenantal aspect to this, which again connects quite starkly with what we have in the Genesis account. And I always find these similarities very interesting. The fact that you have this source of archaic mythology, and it seems to parallel what's in the Bible quite well, as if the Bible does in fact retain very archaic elements, very archaic belief systems. But the point is that this story, which can be basically reduced to humans being disobedient or committing a sin, and then the flood being an act of retribution or punishment for their deeds. This concept, again, is extremely archaic. It's found also in Southeast Australia, which is the most remote part of Australia. You can find some of the most archaic beliefs and myths there. And of course, it's also found in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the northern and northeastern parts of Africa have been influenced by other parts of the world, but the core of sub-Saharan Africa is isolated and is in fact a source of archaic beliefs. And among the Bantu and the Pygmies, we also find a flood myth that's connected to retribution and a wrongdoing. So the point in all of this, in this brief overview, is that the flood myth is so widespread that it cannot be explained by simply saying that this is some kind of motif that is an expression of an archetype of psychology. No, this has so many similarities between the various forms of these myths as they are expressed all over the world, that they must come from a common ancestor or a common origin, an original myth that must have originated from Africa. And so when people are looking for signs of the flood, they're looking in the wrong place. It's not in the Middle East, folks. It's in Africa. And if we're going to be looking at it, you have to go really, really far back. If this was in fact an event, then we're talking something that happened over 70,000 years ago, possibly between 100 to 200,000 years. Okay, that's how far back we have to look if anyone were to really test this. And my personal belief, like I said, is that this is in fact a mythic memory. It is an actual event that happened early on in human history, and it left such an intense impact on us that we still recall it to this very day.